On February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin launched an invasion of Ukraine. His first attacks were west out of the separatist region of Donetsk and Luhansk, quickly followed by a thrust south from Belarus toward Kyiv. Russia's much-vaunted paratroopers and air assault forces attempted several landings outside of Kyiv, but were repelled and failed in their mission. The plan was to quickly take Kyiv by flying reinforcements directly into major airfields outside of the city, and it was immediately canceled. Over the next month, troops pushed north out of Russian-occupied Crimea in an attempt to link up with assaults out of Luhansk and Donetsk. An amphibious invasion of Odessa was greatly feared, but Ukrainian resistance was much stiffer than expected, and the invasion was canceled. In the north of the country, the Kyiv incursion was met with fierce resistance and soon ran into serious logistics problems. Inevitably, Russian forces were forced to flee back to Belarus, having failed to take Ukraine's capital. Similar incursions along the northern border east of Kyiv were also repulsed. Russia moved its defeated troops from the Kyiv assault to the east, where the war was faring better for them. Now, though, Russian forces have reached a sort of stalemate, and the conflict is largely frozen with only minor advancements by either side. Russia, however, has continued to suffer catastrophic defeats, including the near-total defeat of an entire battalion tactical group outside of Bilohorivka, thanks to a well-planned Ukrainian ambush. Kherson, which has been firmly in Russian hands for weeks, is soon to be in dispute with Ukrainian forces making serious pushes toward the city. What Ukraine does when the war is over depends on how the next few months of the war play out. There are two probable scenarios for Ukraine's future and one nightmare scenario that's more frighteningly real than you might realize. But before we look at those scenarios, I have an important question for you. Do you begin every morning by lying in bed and endlessly scrolling through social media looking for news? Maybe you get little snippets of random stories, most of which have literally no relevance to you. If you're like me, then it leaves you feeling unfulfilled, uninformed, and overall it's a terrible way to start off your day. I need to change my routine, which is why I'm so happy I found out about the sponsor of today's video, Morning Brew. Morning Brew is a free newsletter that gets you up to speed on the topics that matter to you in a witty, fun, informative way in just 5 minutes, like why airports have been such a mess lately, why oil prices have been rapidly changing, or that there's a 76 million-year-old dinosaur skeleton about to go up for auction. Of course, it's likely to sell for at least $5 million, so I'll probably be sitting that one out. But unlike the fossilized Gorgosaurus, signing up for Morning Brew is completely free and it takes less than 15 seconds. So whether you're interested in business, finance, or tech, you can become smarter in 5 minutes every day by signing up for Morning Brew at morningbrewdaily.com/infographics or click that link in the description. In the first scenario, Russian forces successfully recouped their losses and pressed their great numbers advantage. By flooding the nation with an additional 24 battalion tactical groups and perhaps enacting general mobilization, Russia begins to put serious pressure on Ukraine's military. Inevitably, the massive Russian war machine slowly but painfully crushes all resistance before it. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has now two choices. First, he can surrender when it becomes clear that further resistance is futile. This will inevitably come at the cost of his own presidency, as the Kremlin will not accept any surrender from Ukraine that doesn't involve the removal of Zelensky as a precondition. This scenario is unlikely, as it would require Russia to generate a significant amount of momentum that it's been unable to generate yet. Only if Russian forces are making advances of several miles or more a day would continued resistance seem futile to Ukrainian defenders. Zelensky would thus see further resistance as simply a waste of his military's lives. But luckily for Ukraine, this seems completely impossible. For starters, Ukraine has a lot of territory to trade for time. This should be a strategy familiar to the Russians, as it's exactly what they did in the war against Germany, trading miles upon miles of territory in exchange for the time to build up proper defenses. Russia, however, is even more vulnerable to a territory for time strategy than Germany was, as their logistics were already terrible to begin with, and only worsened with the destruction of hundreds of cargo and transport trucks by the Ukrainian and foreign volunteers fighting with them. Drawing Russian forces deep into Ukrainian territory will result in overstretched supply lines and open up opportunities elsewhere for Ukraine to counterattack. Russian losses are severe after only 3 months of fighting, with an estimated 25% of all combat personnel from the initial invasion force now either killed or too wounded to continue fighting. Tank and armored vehicle losses for Russia are so heavy, it's estimated it'll take 2 years to replenish them at this point, and the losses continue to mount. In short, Russia cannot realistically generate the momentum necessary for forcing an early surrender by Zelensky, and pumping thousands of freshly mobilized conscripts into the conflict will in all likelihood only hurt the Russian cause rather than help it. So, we're rating an early surrender by Zelensky a very low probability as of May 11, 2022. President Zelensky's second choice is to fight Russia to a slowly losing standstill, What we mean by this is that the front lines will remain largely frozen, but with tiny incremental gains by Russian forces over time. As a matter of fact, that seems to be the nature of the conflict right now, with Russia being hammered badly and winning only small gains, though the Ukrainians themselves have managed their own small gains. So we're not quite at this scenario yet. However, inevitably it might become clear that Russia simply cannot be defeated by Ukraine, and Zelensky's second choice is to negotiate a peace with special conditions with Russia. This will likely mean that Ukraine gives up much of its territory in the Donbas region, which is largely under Russian control today, and gives up its strategic seaports along the Sea of Azov. Crimea is guaranteed to remain in Russian hands, and the Sea of Azov now becomes a Russian lake fully under its control. Initially, Vladimir Putin claimed that he had no intention of occupying Ukraine. However, not only is Putin proven to be a liar, but Russian forces have been well documented doing everything they can to quickly Russify occupied territories. They've replaced Ukrainian street and building signs with their Russian counterparts, instituted provisional governments, ensured the pensions of elderly Ukrainians, and introduced the Russian ruble as the official currency. All this has been done to purposefully entrench Russian culture inside of Ukraine itself, in preparation for their full adoption into the Russian fold. Currently, Ukraine is likely unable to fully eject Russian forces from its territory, which means that this is the most likely scenario. While Ukraine is being armed and supplied by the West, it's not being given the heavy equipment necessary for a large offensive operation against Russian forces. However, if the conflict continues to rage for a year or more, this might change, as it takes months to train Ukrainian crews to operate Western tanks or aircraft, and also set up the supply chains and logistics hubs needed to operate them inside Ukraine. Even then, arming Ukraine at a large scale with Western heavy equipment is incredibly unlikely unless this war drags on for years and becomes another decade-long debacle for Russia, much like Afghanistan was to the Soviet Union and then later the US. It's unlikely then that Ukraine will be able to successfully repel Russia's invasion and push them back to their own borders, though Ukraine could instead make the conflict so painful for Russia that it agrees to a settled peace, with the currently occupied territories part of the cost of continued Ukrainian independence. In this case, without being able to threaten Kyiv, it's highly unlikely that Russia also presses for the removal of President Zelensky, and Ukraine will be able to remain largely free to dictate its own course. It is, however, very likely that peace in either of these two scenarios comes with the condition that Ukraine remain committed to absolute neutrality and repeals its constitutional amendment which enshrines NATO membership directly into the constitution of the country. Depending on how bad the war goes for Ukraine in the long run, additional concessions might have to be given, including the establishment of some form of veto power by Russia over internal Ukrainian matters. In essence, a return to the era of the Soviet Union. The second possible scenario for Ukraine is a total military defeat of Russia and the expulsion of Russian invading forces back to the breakaway regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. Given what we've just discussed, this seems like the far least likely of the two scenarios, but certain key facts could dramatically alter the course of war. The first and likely most important fact is that Russia is taking completely unsustainable losses in the conflict. At a current rate of personnel and equipment loss, Russia will have lost the equivalent of its entire invasion force within 6 more months. An absolute military catastrophe for Russia, which would take decades to recover from. These losses are having a dramatic follow-on effect, though, as reports from all across the front paint a picture of severely demoralized Russian troops. Demoralized troops are a massive liability in war, and the fact that Russia is facing such a significant morale problem that is fed by near daily large-scale losses puts the fighting ability of the Russian military in serious jeopardy. Those losses are inevitably being filled with more and more conscripts as the pool of professional volunteers runs low, and conscripts bring even further weak morale to units already suffering from a borderline morale crisis. But if Russia's only problem was morale, it would count itself lucky, because a big reason for the low morale and high casualties is Russia's sheer ineptitude. The Russian military was greatly feared prior to the conflict, with news agencies around the world commenting on the massive modernization effort Russia undertook over the last 2 decades. To show off its capabilities, Russia put on annual military exercises involving tens of thousands of troops, all meant to showcase Russian firepower to NATO observers. And the conclusions were grim. Russia had become extremely adept at combined arms maneuvers and was a modern military to be feared. Day 1 of the invasion completely changed all of that. And since then, the Russian military has exposed that it's always been a paper tiger. Troops routinely show little discipline and even less training, as they scatter and panic during ambushes instead of fighting back or conducting flank assaults to relieve pressure on the ambush kill zone. Air defense batteries are destroyed on the ground by Ukrainian jets and drones because their operators never bothered to turn their air defense radars on. The Russian military is so inept that Ukraine has even managed to strike deep inside Russia with its own attack helicopters, completely to the surprise of any air defense radar operators. It's not just that Russian troops are poorly trained, it's that Russia is simply bad at war. These exercises, which showed off their great combined arms skills, were clearly highly scripted, because inside of Ukraine, under actual enemy fire, Russia has yet to conduct a satisfactory combined arms operation. In the realm of battlefield logistics, Russia has proven itself to be worse than a novice, as fundamentally its battalion tactical groups simply don't have enough trucks for proper resupply. Russian weapon stockpiles have also run dangerously low of precision munitions, to the point that by the start of May, we are seeing heavy use of unguided bombs and attacks that once used precision munitions. It's now believed that Russia's remaining reserves are a fraction of their original size and dedicated to supporting potential contingency operations in case of war against NATO. That means they can't be used in Ukraine, or else Russia faces being completely unprepared to fight NATO armies. There are even reports that Russia is resorting to the use of mothballed 1960s missiles for long-range strikes, with weapons that are potentially as dangerous to the Russians launching them as they are to whoever's on the other end of the poorly guided munitions. The tale of the tape adds up to this. Russia is entering a serious crisis that could blossom into full-blown catastrophe if the situation on the ground doesn't change dramatically. Unlike Western nations, Russia can't rebuild its precision weapon stockpiles because of global sanctions, as the electronic components it relies on are built in places like Taiwan. This leaves it with only one choice: return to fighting a 20th century conflict much like during the World War II era with comparable equipment. Yet, while Ukraine is suffering its own heavy losses, it's being steadily resupplied by the West. If resupply of heavy equipment continues, and possibly even transfer of Western hardware like the M1 Abrams tank, in 6 months Russia could find itself trying to throw 20th century weapons at 21st century Ukrainian threats. It's not completely inconceivable then that the problems of bad morale, terrible training and doctrine, and a lack of modern equipment leaves the Russians to be overwhelmed by Ukrainian forces equipped with superior Western technologies. A morale crisis similar to the 1917 crisis that resulted in Russia leaving the First World War could prompt a wide-scale defeat of Russia inside Ukraine, and with it a catastrophic political upheaval for Putin that will likely end up with him in prison or more likely dead. But it's exactly the flooding of Ukraine with Western arms that could lead to our third nightmare scenario, and one that's more probable than you think. If Russia begins to suffer serious defeats, or if Ukraine begins to receive large shipments of heavy Western equipment, it might leave Putin with only one choice: the use of weapons of mass destruction. Already, Russia has laid down the groundwork for justifying the use of chemical weapons, as it's used its state propaganda arm to spew a steady stream of lies claiming that Ukrainians have several bio and chemical weapon labs in the country being funded by the United States. Some Russian state news outlets even claim that Ukrainian forces or mercenaries hired by the US have already carried out small-scale chemical attacks. This is merely the beginning of a false flag attack staged by Russia to justify the use of weapons against the stubborn Ukrainian defenders that so far it's failed to dislodge with conventional means. Russia has little to fear from using these weapons too, as Ukraine is unable to respond in kind, as it has no WMDs of its own. We could see widespread chemical attacks across the Eastern Front, followed by massive assaults against severely weakened Ukrainian forces. However, American President Joe Biden has warned that this is a line in the sand for him, and that if Russia were to use WMDs inside Ukraine, the United States would respond appropriately. The interpretation of this response has been purposefully left vague, but it could mean everything from American strikes using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons against Russian forces inside Ukraine to directly supplying Ukraine with its own chemical or biological weapons. Either move would turn Ukraine into a hellscape reminiscent of 1916 Central Europe, only at a far greater magnitude due to the increased lethality of modern chemical and biological weapons. Should Putin step across that line to the use of nuclear weapons, Ukraine might find large swaths of territory irradiated after only even a limited exchange of nuclear weapons. This naturally carries with it the risk of escalation, as Russia and NATO turn their nuclear weapons on each other instead, prompting what might be the final conflict in history. Whatever path Ukraine's future takes, it's certain that it will take years, if not decades, to recover from this war. Many cities are partially or largely destroyed after indiscriminate Russian barrages purposefully targeting civilians, and these will take incredible effort and resources to rebuild. Yet, Europe rebuilt from 2 world wars, and the United States is committed to Ukraine for the long term. We'll likely see a 21st century Marshall Plan after the liberation of Ukraine, financed in large part by the US, and in time the nation will heal. However, in what fashion Ukraine survives as a state, free or Soviet-style client, remains to be seen, as does just how much of its territory it'll get to keep intact. Now go see what's wrong with the Russian military, or click this other video instead.